I didn't realize that it was to contribute to his $4 million.
Yeah. For free.
I think the words he used, I'm sorry to lay this on you at this time.
Yeah.
I
Exactly.
was just helping my wife to grieve, so and he knew that, so in a weak position, I couldn't say no. However, so to speak on funding for climate smart agriculture, I had to go and find out exactly what climate smart agriculture is, and if there are any views or different views as to what it really is, right? But generally, it seems to be accepted that climate smart agriculture will tackle three main objectives. For you who don't know, that is Mr. Greg Rollins, who's
head of delegation. Head of delegation.
The first thing that it aims to achieve is sustainably increasing our agricultural productivity and incomes. And I think that is very critical as we move forward. Secondly, adapting and building resilience to climate change. And the word resilience keeps coming up a lot in the literature. And thirdly, wherever possible, reducing and or removing greenhouse gases. So those are the three main objectives of climate smart agriculture, as I could gather from the literature. Now, I think if you, particularly for the small islands, and even for Guyana and Belize that are low-lying, these are very critical issues if you want to reposition the agriculture in the Caribbean, right? And if we're going to do this, funding is critical. One of the things when we started looking at funding for agriculture, funding for climate smart agriculture, it seems to all carry you back to the Paris Agreement that was signed in April this year, right? By some people say are 78, some people there are 95 members of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Within that agreement, Paras 53 to 65 provide details as to where the financing should go. And critically, the financing is for developing countries and is provided by developed countries. Some critics claim that the agreement does not provide commitments. It only suggests undertakings. And perhaps they're right, because initially it is said that there should be $100 billion US dollars per year to be provided by the developed countries by 2020. And between April and now, it has been expanded or extended to 2025. So you could see there may be some hesitance about it, right? It says very clearly that the money is to be used to enhance implementation of policies, strategies and regulations, and action plans relative to mitigation and adaptation for climate change. So unless you're going to do something with mitigation and adaptation, you cannot get any money out of these funds that come out of the thing, right? It also has established or indicated a number of funds, or strengthened the number of funds. The Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, the Least Developed Countries Fund, and the Special Climate Change Fund. And it identifies a special role for the Global Environment Facility. So what I'm saying that to access these monies, you have to go and spend some time and understand what these funds are about, and what is the Global Environment Facility about. As of June 2016, only 17 countries have ratified the agreement. So the agreement is not in force at this point in time. But countries have until April 2017 to ratify. There are 7 Caribbean countries who have ratified. Guyana, Grenada, Barbados, Belize, St. Kitts, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent have so far ratified the agreements. Notwithstanding that, the multilateral development banks, and I'll name them just now, have developed an approach to tracking climate finance. And some of the things that Steve mentioned is some of the criteria that they've identified. What are these multilateral development banks? The World Bank, IDB, EIB, the European Investment Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, ADB, the Asian Development Bank, and the African Development Bank. So you see these banks are more continental based. So you don't see the CDB, and later on we recognize that the CDB or the Central American Development Banks have to feed out of these banks to get the resources that they require. What has happened is that these banks have decided to say that climate is into everything we do. Right? So it means that agriculture funding has to fit within this climate paradigm. And they've also decided to ramp up climate finance considerably, as I show, to help the poorest and most vulnerable countries to mitigate and adapt to climate change. As a consequence of this, the IDB is going to increase as a percentage of the portfolio by 2020, 14% to 30%. World Bank, 21 to 28%. EIB, up to 25%, but they have also established a figure of 20 billion euros per year for climate funding. And the EU, from 10 to 20%, or approximately 2 billion euros per year. The EU and EIB have coined the term, it seems, talking about blended financing. Blended financing means that they're going to prefer to deal with both the public and the private sector as they move ahead. So we see that if everything goes okay, and we don't know yet, because they're not commitments, they're undertakings, there's potentially a fair amount of money for agriculture within climate change. Right? But in no case is agriculture specifically identified, except in low carbon financing, where it is linked to forestry. Right? So we have to be innovative as we move ahead to gather funds for agriculture within climate change. And some of the areas that we may want to look at are enhancing climate resilience, community development, and renewable energy. If we could find or projects to fit within those things, it would probably be easier to get the funding from those areas. They've also identified some criteria where these proposals must fit. And this is where the C-SAC tool could be helpful. The procedures must be transparent. There must be measures in the implementation to minimize fraud and corruption. This word fraud and corruption keeps popping up in all sources these days. There must be benchmarks for independent evaluation, and the C-SAC tool allows you to have some benchmarks that could do. There must be sustainability, and in that case, I think Steve's point must not be a one-off project. So there must be sustainability, and there must be very positive environmental impact. And you must be able to measure the results in a tangible fashion. All right? So those are some of the things that are critical if you want to access funding from these facilities. What about funding within the Caribbean? As I sort of alluded to, the Caribbean Development Bank and the 5 Cs have to get their funding out of these resources. Right? So we see that the Caribbean Development Bank has been accredited as the regional executing agency for the Adaptation Fund and is close to achieving similar accreditation for the Green Climate Fund. But I also noted that the 5 Cs is also accredited for the for the Green Climate Fund. So I'm not sure how exactly, I couldn't get hold of any fellows at the climate in 5Cs for them to explain to me how they're going to manage this interrelationship. In addition to that, the CDB has a funding for all. The CDB funds is managed by the Environmental Sustainable Unit. And one of the surprising things I noted is that each of these facilities that I'm going to tell you about briefly have a different procedure for accessing. So you really have to review and study them carefully as you go into access. Now, I see Steve shaking his head, but I think the problem is not CDB.
Yeah.
It's the source of the fund.
Yeah.
All right. So, yeah. There's the Climate Action Line of credit funded by the EU for both private and public sector projects. As I mentioned to you, the EU is putting a lot of emphasis on blending of projects. There's the technical assistance grants in support of this Climate Action Line to enhance vulnerability assessments, the capacity for vulnerability assessments, and human capacity development, human infrastructure in the area of climate change, and for us it will be specifically climate smart agriculture. There's a community disaster risk reduction fund, and when I read this, I remember when I was at Cardi, we tried to get some money out of that fund to do some work in Namibia, and it was like pulling teeth without cocaine.
Yeah.
Eventually we didn't get it, we couldn't satisfy all the criteria. All right. But what this fund aims to do is to demonstrate how the community could reduce natural hazards and how it is adapting to climate change. They also have a component of the regional EU ACP funded disaster management grant assistance, which is very specific. It talks about developing resilience to roads and to the road and water sectors. Right? So again, community-based. You have to talk, see how the farm to market roads, etc., how you can deal with that. Right? In terms of the Caribbean, the 5 Cs, the 5 Cs give support to Global Climate Change Alliance. As I said, I already said, is accredited to the Green Climate Fund. It has an agreement with the Caribbean catastrophe, this word always gives me trouble, risk insurance facility. So anytime any country that wants money from this facility, that's go through the 5 Cs. So those are some of the funds that are available globally, and those which, from the literature, have started to trickle down to the region. In summary, there are substantial funds pledged to climate change. As I said, we're seeing some of those funding packages for some of those funds already trickling into the region. Again, I want to reiterate that we have to be innovative to be able to use those funds, because it does not specifically identify agriculture, much less climate smart agriculture, not even noted. But however, I tend to be a little positive because our culture still remains important to the region, still it addresses quantitative and qualitative honesty, both safe and nutritious food. That's a qualitative aspect of it. And because the multilateral development banks have decided to put climate into everything they do, we must be innovative enough to be able to find ways and means of addressing or finding ways and means to get some of these funds. And I want to think that the tool that Steve has identified and worked on will help us to satisfy some of the criteria that they've listed if you wish to access these funds. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.